Hello and welcome everyone to Science Era. In this video, we're going to discuss difference between DNA and RNA. Starting with the full form of DNA and RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, while RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. Their location: DNA is found in the nucleus with a small amount of DNA also present in a mitochondria. So mainly found in nucleus but in small amount present in mitochondria. While RNA forms in the nucleolus and then moves to specialized region of the cytoplasm depending on the type of RNA formed. Structure of DNA and RNA. DNA have a long ladder-like macromolecule that twists to form a double helix structure, while RNA, in contrast to a double helix structure of DNA, RNA is generally single-stranded. Helix geometry. The helix geometry of DNA is of a beta form, while the helix geometry of RNA is of alpha form. Nucleotides. Each DNA nucleotide contains one of the four nitrogenous bases abbreviated as A, G, T, C, where A stands for adenine, G stands for guanine, T stands for thymine, and C cytosine. RNA contains the nitrogenous base uracil in place of thiamine. Chains of nucleotides. DNA long chains of nucleotides are present, while RNA relatively short chains of nucleotides are present in RNA. Sugars. DNA contains deoxyribose sugar, while RNA contains a different sugar in its nucleotide, ribose rather than deoxyribose. So D in DNA stand for deoxyribose and R in RNA stands for ribose sugar. Base pairs. Adenine and thymine pairs and cytosine and guanine pairs in DNA. So you can remember it in mnemonic like ATCG. RNA, adenine and uracil pairs and cytosine and guanine pair. Base pair ratio. In case of DNA, adenine is equal to thymine and guanine is equal to cytosine. While in case of RNA, adenine is not equal to thymine and guanine is not equal to cytosine. Molecular weight. Molecular weight of DNA is 2 to 6 million while RNA is 25,000 to 2 million. Molecule. DNA does not usually exist as a single molecule but instead as tightly associated pair of molecules, while RNA may exist as a single molecule. Propagation. DNA is self-replicating while RNA is synthesized from DNA on an as-needed basis. Propagation of major enzymes. DNA polymerase is the major enzyme for propagation in DNA, and RNA polymerase is the major enzyme for propagation in RNA. Need of primer. Primer necessary to initiate replication in DNA, while no primary primer is needed for RNA. Proofreading activity. DNA proofreading is present in DNA while absent in RNA since RNA polymerase lacks the ability to detect error of base pairing. Polymer length. DNA is much longer polymer than RNA. A chromosome, for example, is a single long DNA molecule which would be several centimeters in length when unraveled. RNA molecules are variable in length. but much shorter than long DNA polymers, a large RNA molecule might only be a few thousand base pair long. Leaving nucleus. DNA can't leave the nucleus while RNA can leave the nucleus, and the form of RNA which leaves the nucleus is mRNA, messenger RNA. Complementary forms. Complementary forms are mostly between two DNA strands, while in RNA, RNA strands can form complementary structure with strands of either DNA or RNA. Destruction and reuse. DNA is a completely protected by body. For example, the body destroys enzyme that cleaves DNA or destroy DNA. RNA strands are continually made, broken down, and reused. Hydrolyzing enzymes, DNAs, and in RNA, RNAs. Function of DNA includes strong genetic information, direct protein synthesis, determined genetic coding, directly responsible for metabolic activities, evolution, heredity, and differentiation. RNA functions include transferring genetic information from DNA to proteins, carrying it outside the nucleus, and translating it to the protein. Role as genetic material. DNA is found in all organisms other than certain viruses. RNA found very rarely in some viruses. Versatility and usefulness. DNA are more stable and holds more complex information for longer period of time, while RNA is more versatile than DNA, capable of performing numerous diverse tasks in an organism. Stability. DNA, due to its deoxyribose sugar, which contain one less oxygen containing hydroxyl group, DNA is a more stable molecule than RNA. DNA is stable under alkaline conditions. RNA, containing a ribose sugar, is more reactive than DNA and is not stable in alkaline condition. RNA larger helical grooves mean it is more easily subject to attack by enzymes. Ultraviolet sensitivity. DNA is vulnerable to damage by UV lights, while RNA is more resistant to damage from UV light than DNA. Mutation rate. DNA's mutation rate is relatively lower, while RNA's mutation rate is relatively high. Unusual bases. No unusual bases are ever found in DNA, while RNA may um, bases may be present, but rarely in RNA. Rate of renaturation after melting. DNA relatively slower rate, RNA quick rate of renaturation after melting. Types. DNA, chromosomal DNA or nuclear DNA, and extra chromosomal DNA, for example, plasmid DNA, mtDNA, or CHL DNA. RNA, messenger RNA, or we can say mRNA. tRNA is transfer RNA, and rRNA is ribosomal RNA. This brings us to the end of difference between DNA and RNA. If you like my video, don't forget to subscribe for more.